working with margins and columns. So the reason why we set up our columns is to essentially keep all of our main content, so thinking our copy, things like that, within our margin. So within this pink line here, this was set up at the beginning, which is at a 1/2 inch. It's not to say that everything has to stay within the margins. You can bleed your imagery off of the margin. You can potentially any design elements can bleed off of your page and outside of your margin, but thinking about your main content sits within that margin. So say we feel like we would like a little more space. So if this is our margin, that means we're going to set our text up to begin here and potentially could end here, depends if it's 1 or 2 columns. I personally find 1/2 inch a little bit close for this document size. So let's go ahead and adjust that. Say for instance, if it's already been set. We can go File, Document Setup, and then we can go right here and adjust. So let's go ahead and change that to, we'll just say 0.175. You can also add a preview on there so you can get a visual if you feel that's maybe a bit heavy, depends on how much content you have, etc. You can adjust that margin. So we press OK. That's been applied to our 2 spreads because that was done through the document setup. And now we're ready to approach our grid. So when we approach our grid, we want to make sure we're in our parent page or a master page. We get into those by double clicking. And then we also have a nice visual here at the very bottom left that says A parent. So we know that whatever we're working on right now is on our parent page. This parent page is the letter A. And we can see here because the letter A is on all 4 of those pages, whatever happens here will apply to any page with the letter A. So let's go ahead and adjust. So we're going to go Layout. We can do it 2 ways. Let's start here. Create Guides. The advantage to creating your guides here is that you can set up both a vertical and a horizontal grid. So first of all, I'm going to just start with our columns. And once we start clicking, you can turn that preview on so you get a visual. We get a nice visual of how many grids we should do. I personally believe and would suggest a nice even number is always easiest to work with when it comes down to designing. It's up to you to make that decision yourself, but I would personally suggest an even number. And I also feel that anything below 0.1875 is a bit close for a gutter. So you can see as we bring that gutter up, we can see between those columns it's going down. I'm sorry, going up. So I'm going to stick with a 0.125. So what's happening now is InDesign is calculating 8 columns with a 1/4 of an inch gutter. It is basing that under options because page is checked off. So that means it's basing that number off of this far left edge to this right edge, not the spread, but just the 1 page. Because as mentioned earlier, we set up our content when inside of our margins, it's not valuable to set our grid up that's outside of that margin. You can see here now it's our gutter is sitting too close to where we should be starting our content. So we want to make sure that we check off margins. And now that 8 column grid is sitting and based upon the interior of that. From here now we can set up the rows. To be totally transparent, I don't personally use rows as a grid or a horizontal grid. I use my guides and ensure that elements are placed and aligned with something else versus sticking to an actual horizontal grid. And also just prefer to use the baseline grid when it gets down to body copy. Saying that, if you feel that you're always kind of having things misaligned from one page to the other, if you place a picture box here and then it's just a little bit lower visually, it looks a little bit disorganized, go ahead and make that a horizontal grid. Again, I would stick with even numbers, and then potentially that can help keep some consistency and keep things nice and level. Now we go ahead and we press OK. And since we did that within our parent page, when we go down to our document pages, we can see that grid is set up. So saying that, I personally get a little bit distracted with all of the grids, not just because of the the horizontal grid included in there. I like that my pink margin is there, and I kind of prefer to have my grid set up within that pink margin versus using it using our guides. So I'm just going to go ahead and undo that and show you another way to create your grid. So again, going back into your parent page, in this way, we want to make sure that we have both pages highlighted. This will also be key to ensure you have to make sure the left page matches the right page. So from layout, we do the same. We go to the same menu, but this time we're going to go to margins and columns. So from here, we can actually adjust our margin as well. But what we can also do is adjust our columns. So you can see those show up in a pink format. Again, it's personal preference. I personally prefer this visual for me. Again, saying that, reminder that you don't have the option for the horizontal grid from the margins and columns menu. So we can work on a 6 or an 8. And again, we could change our gutter. We can go back in and readjust if we need to. And again, now that grid is set up. For those that might be wondering, why the heck do we possibly use this grid? It's to make sure all of our pieces and elements stay consistent with one another. We have even pieces. Everything is nicely aligned. We can have a large image. It could take up all of the rows. Using smart guides will also be your absolute best friend here. And now if we imagine these are all pictures, maybe this is a picture, maybe this is a text block, maybe this is a color block. I'm literally just working with pink boxes, but we see a nice cohesive and consistent look and feel. Last, but absolutely certainly not least, when we are working with our baseline grid. When we place our copy in here, ensure a couple things from our paragraph menu. Always turn hyphenation off. And if we are set here that says do not align to baseline grid, that's not going to work. You need to say align to the baseline grid. So when we set this to aligning with our baseline grid, I'm just going to plunk some copy in there. Let's make sure we're working with our actual grid here. The baseline grid is set to work off of your leading. So by default, what the leading is going to be default within your settings. If, for instance, my body copy 12 is a bit large for body copy, say for a magazine, for instance, I would bring that down to 10. I'm just going to take this baseline grid off for a moment. And let's say I actually prefer a nice open leading on our based upon my 12-point type. Let's go ahead and turn that back on. And we can now see we've set it to 14, but that spacing is all kinds of wrong. So what we need to do to adjust that, we go InDesign preferences, guides, and right in here within our baseline grid. The reason why this is so large is because it is set to a 12-point increment. As I said, our leading, we adjusted to 14, so it's giving a whole lot of extra space because there's no in between here. So instead, we're going to adjust that to 14, and we're going to press OK. And now it looks a little cleaner, it looks a little tinier, and it works much, much better. So now if I place some copy down here, it's always going to, it'll adjust itself to properly align. If you like to see your baseline grid, personally, it drives me a little bit crazy. You can go grids, show baseline grid. If you happen to say show baseline grid and you're like, I swear I checked that off, where did it go? Go into your preferences, under grids. If you bring that number up, other way around. I always mix that up. If you bring that number down from the view threshold, you'll be able to see it. Okay, so now you can actually see where that grid is hinging to. So you can see it in action. If I try to bump this text box down, my actual body copy isn't moving. And there it goes.